On December 24, 1965, two York Presbyterian congregations made national history by becoming one of only 3 interracial mergers during the Civil Rights Movement. But what made the merger of Faith and First Presbyterian particularly unique was the fact that the newly called pastor of Faith was a personal friend of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose counsel he had sought before deciding to accept the call to this black congregation as their pastor. In addition, only 9 months before the famous Christmas Eve merger, Reverend Douglas G. Parks would march with John Lewis on Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, and eventually with both King and Lewis on to Montgomery. There is no doubt you will want to hear Doug's compelling story told in this special 3-part series of Hey First Pres, What's Up? Hi, and welcome back to Hey First Pres, What's Up? We are here at beautiful Lake Maury Resort in Fairleigh, Vermont. This is the second part of a 2-part episode of our podcast, and we are here with the Reverend Douglas G. Parks. Have had an awesome conversation in the first part, so make sure that if you're seeing this part first, you need to go back and see part 1. And so Doug, thank you once again for being with us today and just sharing some awesome stories and just insights into your work with civil rights, and particularly with MLK, John Lewis, we'll be talking about in a few moments, but also as interim at Faith Presbyterian and the merger with First Presbyterian in 1965, which is where we want to pick up. We kind of left off at the first part on your call that you had consulted with MLK on a couple of occasions. First of all, what do you put in your application? Since you've been arrested a number of times, how do you put that delicately? And
civil rights arrest,
but for a very good reason. Anyway, about that, and then eventually consulting with him about accepting the call to Faith Presbyterian and the purpose for which you were being called there, which was to seek out an eventual merger with another Presbyterian church, albeit would be white. So let's talk about what that task was like for you. That you told us that the denomination said you needed to do a sociological study and talk with all the clergy. So how'd you go about that?
Whoa, well, how did I go about that? Well, I just, there were about 8 churches that I needed to see, and I just started focusing, keeping notes on each one. I would just block out some time to visit each one of these churches, call them up, and ask for a sit down with the pastors first, and discuss the possibility of an interracial merger. And if the clergy seemed
Hesitant?
What was your word?
Hesitant?
Hesitant or worse.
Okay.
Then I left it at that.
Yeah.
If I felt like there was possibilities with the interviews of the clergy, then I would ask them if I could speak to some of their members, both people who might, in their minds, be very positive, and also those who would have mixed feelings. And so that's how I pursued it.
Okay.
And
kept copious notes.
Kept copious notes, indeed. But it didn't take me, I mean, I did this over a number of months, quite a few months, because your regular duties as a pastor take a lot of time. So I had to put it in, and I did this over a period of maybe 4 or 5 months. and the National Church wanted me to keep them abreast of the progress. And it was slow going because it's such a important subject, racial issues, and how the church deals with racial issues. So I was very careful to broach the subject in an open way, but um, firm about what I felt the criteria needed to be for the possibility of a merger. That was so important because the lives of my people were at stake here, and that's who I was defending in this situation.
There was still in New York at that time, even in '65, segregation was still practiced in the city, was it not?
It was indeed. It was indeed. And um, during my pastorate there, we did a number of demonstrations. The Klan was a major issue for us. The Klan had actually shot up a few churches in those days. Had demonstrated in downtown New York. We had some cross burnings, and
Still designated whites only, coloreds only, or Negroes only?
not too much of that Jim Crow stuff, but there were a number of known restaurants in town that would only serve whites.
Okay.
And I took it upon myself to ask the editor of the Gazette and Daily, who was a friend of mine, a developed friend of mine. I didn't know him prior to arriving in New York, but he was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard and then got the job at York, and happened to be black. I asked him on several occasions if he would like to have dinner with me at some of these establishments. And he said he thought about it and he said, "Yeah, let's do it." So we would go to these restaurants and that were known segregated restaurants for eating, and we would park my car facing outward because you never knew
No.
what was going to happen when you walked in the door. And the chap's name is Bob Maynard, who did a great job in New York, and also was a friend of faith and subsequently First Presbyterian Church when he was still in New York. But he was instrumental in getting our messages out about civil rights, and he also was a participant. He went on to become the publisher of the Oakland Tribune.
Oh, okay.
Big deal.
Yeah, really.
And he was in my wedding.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I had two people. I got married in New York, and several people from the church came up. And Cleo Carr
Oh, really?
sang at my funeral, and Bob Maynard was one of my ushers.
Neat.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And at that time, by the way, I was that was in 1968. I was now an assistant minister at First Presbyterian Church, Chicago.
Oh, okay.
And I was working with black gangs at that point. And that was a tough job because during the year and a half that I was there, 14, I believe it was 14 kids all under the age of 18 were shot to death that we worked with. It was a terrible situation. But in terms of the wedding, some of their leaders, seven leaders came to that church in New York from Chicago.
Wow.
And it astonished the wedding witnesses, to say the least, because they dressed in marvelous clothing, great color assortments, and they stood in the back of the church, stood there as like guards for us, as though we needed guards for a wedding. But it was hilarious. And when I talked to Cleo, who's now 95, he remembers the situation well, but he thinks that they were Black Panthers.
Oh,
which
really?
was funny. But they were just as tough because they were Chicago street gang kids.
But it shows the respect they had.
Yeah, they did. It was amazing, and they were almost more nervous being in the small town of Pelham than they were in downtown Southside Chicago. It was too silent at night, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think, though, that once again, we have to be reminded that during the time of the merger, or when you were beginning the conversations, the racial unrest in York, as it was in the rest of the country, but specifically York, was very much front and center.
Yeah.
This was not a quiet time at all to be talking about merging a black and white congregation.
that's a really good point. And we were confronted on a fairly regular basis by Carl McIntyre, who was a defrocked
Oh, yes.
Presbyterian minister
Mm-hmm.
who was the head of the Klan
Yes.
down in Red Lion, and he had a radio station,
Mm-hmm.
and he was broadcasting all kinds of nasty things about what was going on in York, specifically condemning me as a white pastor who was inclined to push this merger.
You heretical Presbyterian, you.
Yeah, he should know all about
Heresy, right?
Heresy.
Yes. Carl McIntyre, yes. Yes.
So we decided to take him on. And so
Oh,
I asked
really?
Cleo, who was kind of my wingman in those days. I spent a lot of time at their house, many dinners, and a lot of singing. His wife played the piano, and Cleo is a great singer.
My God.
And the two of us set off for Red Lion, and I had a debate with McIntyre on his radio station.
Did you really?
Yeah, yeah. And we parked facing outward.
They didn't block you in?
No, we didn't know if we were going to get out. So,
Oh my
yeah, it was a challenge.
Okay, these are things I didn't know about your
No.
little time there in
No,
York.
you didn't know about that, but I mean.
Well, that must have made it all the more difficult when you went to go visit these other churches,
Oh,
because
absolutely.
this was hardly quiet on the side.
No, it was
secret
not quiet.
stuff.
It was not quiet. And, I got fairly typical responses from these churches. They were either not interested or it was going to be too difficult. And the ones that were, there were a couple that had a possibility. So in that case, I talked to a number of their parishioners, and then it just left me cold,
Yeah.
frankly.
Well, you can tell.
And yeah, you can tell, all right. So finally, I was 0 for 7, I guess it was. And the last church that I interviewed was First Presbyterian Church. And it was very enlightening to see, first of all, that Dick Ullman was solidly behind this, both theologically and from a human standpoint, a sociological position. He was strongly in favor, and a very academic kind of guy who saw the reality of the situation. The times were changing, and this would be a good move for both churches, he felt. So that was great. And then Ray Brubaker, a younger guy, as the assistant minister, was also full of a joyous response and believed we could do this. So I began to talk to members of the congregation, First Church's congregation, and I found some people who were dead against it, some people who were moderates, and others who were very strongly for it. And I told the National Church in New York that if there was any hope at all, it was definitely First Presbyterian and none of the others. And so they said, try and pursue it. And that's what we did.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then that was a whole process you had to go through as you bring about conversations between the sections of the
Yes.
two congregations, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We did that. And I had a lot of meetings with my own people, of course, because
Right.
not everybody at Faith Church wanted to go.
Mhm.
Some of the oldest people were either totally for it, interestingly enough, or totally against it. They didn't think they could make the move at their age,
And I
spiritually transferring over.
we
They
had
felt
mentioned
discomfort.
you know, when you say some of the older folks who were totally for it, as we were talking before over lunch, yes, folks, we had to take a lunch break to come back. Is that some of those oldest members of Faith, when you were there, very well could have been charter members
Members.
of Faith, which was formed in 1893, strongly encouraged by Samuel Small, who was an elder at First Presbyterian and instrumental in forming Calvary United Presbyterian Church.
Mhm.
And then his niece, I believe, certainly would be Sally, was Westminster Presbyterian Church.
Mhm.
But the Small family itself were very strong abolitionists during the 1800s.
Mhm.
And then Henry Niles was also a very strong advocate for abolitionist. They're involved with Lincoln University.
Mhm.
So First Presbyterian, way back in its history, did have a strong group of people at that church
Mhm.
who were advocates for African Americans, and particularly those who wanted to be Black Presbyterians.
Yes.
And I would think that those charter members would never have forgotten that. So by 1965, for some of them who would perhaps have memories that go back that far,
Mhm.
First Presbyterian was probably a more logical place,
Mhm.
and they wanted to stay Presbyterian.
Yes. Right.
They did not want to be Baptist or AME, but they preferred to be Presbyterian.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, we clearly had people in the church who were not historically Presbyterian. We had Baptists, we had
Mhm.
some AME people, a few Methodists, but the vast majority of people wanted to go. I mean, it wasn't a large church. We had
No.
about 100 members, as I
Okay.
recall. But we had some really good, strong young members
Mhm.
in their 20s and 30s and 40s that were really interested in doing this. And, you know, we took votes, and the session was strongly for it. It took a while to, you know, to get this thing moving because there was some hesitancy whether or not people would feel comfortable in a church that was much larger than our church.
Mhm.
And whether it could work and whether they could feel comfortable as members of a family as opposed to being guests of a
Yeah.
church group. And I think for some, and probably even today, there may be that kind of question. Is it a family or are we guests? Are we historical guests in
Or a marriage of convenience.
a marriage of convenience type of
Mhm.
thing? Yeah. So.
Yeah, First Presbyterian continues. You and I have talked about that. First Presbyterian continues to struggle in a good way about its identity and what does it mean to be a multicultural or multi-ethnic congregation. Is it in word only, or is it beyond that?
Right.
And,
In the inner city.
yeah, in the inner city, and a congregation that is historical, long history,
Very historical.
and what we add the word prestigious, if you will. And some people have a certain image of what they think that church should be versus others. And this conversation continues to go on. So whatever was going on back in 1965, as both congregations were deciding, do we want to get married or not, we're still having some of those conversations today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But looking at it from quite a distance from California,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing what I know about what's going on in your church now, I like the trend it's taking. I'm really excited about that. I think you have some excellent leadership in Allison and Kyle, and the Virginia Hunter, a dear woman from
God bless
congregation.
miss her.
Yes,
We
indeed.
miss her dearly.
I know she was a big influence
Yes, she
in
was.
the merger. And her son Chris now, who I've gotten to know quite well and talk to every week.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing this now for a couple of months. We
Yeah,
talk
he
every
cherishes
week,
those conversations.
and so do I.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris. I'm sure you're watching.
He will be.
And
Yes, he will.
yeah, so and your recent hires in the last
Delas Johnson and
Delas.
Marcia.
yes
Mayfield.
in the last year or so,
Yes,
year and a half.
year and a
Yes,
half.
or-
Well, Delas
Delas.
much longer.
Yeah.
18, 19 months, and Marcia last November.
Yeah, I think they are both going to make tremendous contributions to the church and the work of the church, God's work in York. I've seen the podcasts involving
Mm-hmm.
those two women, and I'm really impressed. And I think they can add a great deal to the life of the church in the city.
So you were in the middle of all that, of having to kind of sift out those congregations and eventually settling on First Presbyterian. And in the middle of this whole process, plus being a pastor of the congregation, you get a phone call in February of 1965
Yeah,
from none other than your friend, Martin Luther King
yeah.
Jr.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised. I thought he was just calling to see how
How you
things were
doing?
going down there in York, PA.
Little
It's
did you know.
17 miles from the Mason-Dixon
Yes.
line, as I've learned
Yes.
from Guy, because I thought it was 35 mile. I knew it was pretty close.
But
not that close. It felt like I was
Maybe it
that
was better you
close.
didn't know you were that close.
And my wife is a Southerner, so
Yeah, really.
it really got close.
Yeah.
So Dr. King gave me a call, not just to check up on how things were going, but to ask a favor. And that favor was a mighty big favor because he knew I had been doing voter registration when we weren't demonstrating back in Charleston, South Carolina, and so I had experience doing that for the past summer, and he decided that he was going to take SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and focus on voter registration drives, a drive in Selma, Alabama, which had already been underway for 2 years, led by SNCC, the Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under the leadership of their president, John Lewis. Actually, he was co-president. But but they were stalled out in some ways at that point, and so Dr. King thought it would be great if they could team up as two civil rights organizations and give them some new blood and new ideas to help out and try and make some progress, because Selma was a town of about 45,000 people that was half black, and had 2% of its population registered to vote. I mean,
Wow.
pathetic, absolutely pathetic. And so I immediately responded to him and I said, I would love to go, but I've got to get permission for my session. I can't just take off. They got to find someone to replace me here for I don't know, a couple weeks. That's not easy to do. And the counseling and the marriages and what have you. But so I approached the session with him. I told him Dr. King had called and that he wanted my experience with registering people, and would they allow me to go? And they thought about it for about a day, and some of them said, yeah, right away you can go, but they said we need to take a vote and we really need to pray over it. And they did, and
And it needs to be in those wonderful session minutes.
yes,
That it was officially
yeah, it was
granted.
officially sanctioned.
Yes, as Presbyterians,
That's right.
decently and in order,
Yes.
it must be in there.
Must be sanctioned, right? So, yeah, so they said, you know, God bless, go well, and I took off and I drove down there and arrived on March 1st, and I was assigned the Selma Hotel, and I checked in, and a couple hours later I found out that I had a roommate, and my roommate was none other than Dick Gregory, and what an astonishing
Wow.
meeting that was with him. I recognized him immediately because I had seen on television a number of his stand-up comedy reviews
Mhm.
and guest appearances on the late night shows.
Okay. Wow.
So, and there he was in full beard, standing in front of me with a big bag full of what I thought were groceries. And I introduced myself and I said, "What do you got there?" And he said, "My lunch, breakfast, and dinner." And I said, "Wow." And he started taking out one bottle, the quart bottles, big quart bottles, taking one bottle out after another and setting it on a table. And I said, "Where's the food?" And he said, "That is my breakfast, lunch, and dinner, along with water." And I said, "Are you kidding me?" And he said, "No, I'm a vegan, but I'm right now a juicitarian."
Was he really?
Juicitarian, and he said, I live my life drinking these different juices, orange juice, grapefruit juice, and what have you, and a lot of water, and that's how I live my life, and I have plenty of energy." I thought, well, this is an interesting start. Now, if you can only share some jokes with me, I will be greatly.
Maybe that was a joke and you didn't know it.
Yeah, maybe it was. But my apprehension about Soma was reduced by him, as I think everybody's was, because he did a number of enlightening talks with everybody, not just me late at night, but he shared his wisdom and humor with a lot of us, and it really helped
Wow.
lighten
Interesting.
the loads.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that was the start, and right away, Dr. King assigned me to and John Lewis as well took it on. Now he had already been down there, but he was doing this daily. He was finding out what folks wanted to register or willing to try to register to vote, and then he and other members of SNCC would take them to the county court house and try and get them enrolled. But the problems were great, and King said, "Well, you've got experience. I'm going to assign you to do that too, and you have a car. So I'll give you the names of people and addresses and notify them that you're coming." And I thought that was really smart on his part, because
Mhm.
when I show up at some houses,
Just like Faith.
you know, it's like Faith Church,
What are you
right?
doing here?
What are you doing here, kid? Here comes Whitey.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that was my assignment, to take people, and I had been told that the courthouse is supposed to be open from 9 to 3, I believe, but don't count on it. That's what the experience was. So right away, that afternoon, I got my first group of 2 families in the car. I had four or 5 adults that first day, and we went down there at about 2:00, and it wasn't open. But it did open. No, it didn't open. That's right. So we had to go back the next day, and we waited on the steps in the morning. It was not open again. It did open at 1:00, and I think it stayed open only for 1 hour. They only let about 6 or 7 people in, and it was
This was-
preposterous what they did.
It was all intentional.
It was all intentional. It was deliberate. It's just like today, voter suppression personified.
Make it more difficult.
Make it so difficult because the people filled out an application and they looked at it and then they said, okay, there's a test that people have to take. What he really meant was there's a test that black people had to take, and it involved things like recite the preamble to the Constitution accurately. And you know, I mean, who can do that, right? Or how many counties are there in Alabama? And if they felt like maybe you had been trained to answer correctly, and who knew the answer to that anyway, but maybe they thought that I had trained them to say 67, then they might say something like, name them. We need to know what they are. We need to know that you know what they are. Well, who's going to be able to mention 67 counties? Or how many judges are there in Dallas County? And if you knew the name of, if you knew how many judges there were, they'd say, what are their names? I mean, it's preposterous, absolutely sickening. And if you, for some outstanding reason, could answer all those questions, then you still had to pay a poll tax. I mean, this is Jim Law, this is Jim Crow personified.
Yeah.
So it was dreadful. On that second day, that's where I met John Lewis for the first time. And because we had to sit, he had a group of people too, and there were actually about 3 or 4 groups. We were all waiting to get in. But I think we were let in first because they couldn't believe that there was a guy of light complexion bringing a group of people to register. They want to know who the heck I was. And yeah, I mean, that's the way they felt. And
Yeah. So it's interesting. Once again, we're talking about God used your complexion as a door, as a way to open doors, good, bad, or indifferent.
yeah.
At least nothing else gained the curiosity of those who were oppressing black voters in the South.
Yeah. You know, I think they were lining me up for whatever they had in mind.
Or
which
also trying to
wasn't-
figure out why you were even doing it.
Yeah. Which turned out to be something that was very worrisome.
Yeah.
I think they wanted to get rid of me. And,
Well, I certainly didn't want to see more and more whites
No.
start to take the side of
That's
our
right.
black brothers and sisters.
and what was interesting is that the town in those days was starting to grow with people coming in. The word was getting out. I know I was calling people and trying to encourage some of my personal friends to come down and be a part of this.
Okay.
Because King had said we're going to be marching.
Right.
Right off the bat, he told me we're going to be marching. And so he said, you've got some friends that might be able to come down. Tell them to come down. We can use numbers.
Yeah.
And people whose hearts are in the right places.
What was it like to meet this John Lewis, whose speech you thought was so fiery there in Washington, to actually now meet this man?
Oh, it was great. It was great. You know, to me, he was just another kid like I was.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to keep reminding myself, you were no older than about KG. Gorin, our
I don't know
director.
how old he is.
Oh, he's 26. He just turned 26.
Oh, okay. And I think I was 27,
Okay.
and John was 24, 25.
Okay. All
Around
right.
that age range. So we're, young Turks. And,
Yeah, really.
And he just was an interesting guy to me because he was so friendly and curious. John Lewis asked lots of questions.
Okay.
And at the same time as being funny and curious, he was also pretty intense.
Yeah.
A pretty intense guy at that age. And so we began to have these raps on the stairs where we're killing hours waiting with the poor folks who wanted to register to vote. I mean, it's just really brutal to sit there in the heat of Selma.
And to convince them that they really wanted to hang around long enough to do
And
it.
stay, yeah, and all of that. So I had some really pretty good conversations with John that got longer and longer as we were sitting there, days after days. Well, it wasn't that long. It was a week, yeah, from the 1st to the 7th, when we actually had the first march, known as Bloody Sunday.
Right.
And we got along well because we were both young. We both had theological backgrounds. He went to the American Baptist Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay.
He went to college there too, in Nashville. And I went to Union Seminary in New York City. So we had that in common. We had our youth in common. We had the same drive in common, but we are totally different people.
Yeah.
John was raised in Troy, Alabama, which is down in the southeast corner of Alabama, really rural. His parents were sharecroppers, and his job was to pick cotton on this farm and watch the animals. And as he told me, he also, because he was religious, and he used to listen to preachers on his radio,
Okay.
he started acting like he could preach at an early age. You know, like when he was 10, 11 years old. He said, I would go out in the fields and preach to the cows.
Did they
I
like
thought
it?
that was hilarious. That was so much different than my life. Of course, here in Vermont, I mean, I'm around a lot of animals myself here now.
Yeah.
I saw 3 deer this morning, right
Oh.
outside of my brother's bedroom window
Did you preach to them?
there. I was in awe.
You were in just all.
I was in awe. Yeah, it was a doe and her 2 little offsprings,
Oh, that is cool.
10 feet away.
That's
And
cool.
fortunately, they didn't hear me, and I just peeked from the side of the window, and it was marvelous. I watched them for 10 minutes before they took off.
Well, we're waiting because when we came down 89, Interstate 89 from Burlington, we saw moose crossings
Yeah.
and bear crossings.
Mhm.
So we're waiting to see our first moose while we're up here. I don't know if we ever will, but
Yeah, they're not as prevalent here as they are in New Hampshire.
we have to go over the border.
Yeah, but that's only 2 miles.
Yes, because they go 2 miles and go see the moose.
You cross the Connecticut River and you're in New Hampshire,
Okay.
and there's a bridge right here in this town that can take you there.
Oh,
So
okay.
maybe after this is over, take yourself a little ride.
Right.
You're more likely to see a bear, actually.
Oh.
We saw one at the next door neighbor's house to my brother 4 days ago. We went right across the front lawn, and then that neighbor called up my brother to warn him that there was a bear in the immediate neighborhood.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's good because my brother lives on a dirt road, and that's partly because the town doesn't have a big budget, and there's a lot of horseback riding around here, and so the road was never paved, and so it's very.
So you and
blessed.
John came from very different backgrounds. It was interesting when you said about his parents being sharecroppers, and
Yeah.
he was by virtue is the fact that we had learned the last time I interviewed Delash Johnson that her mom, growing up in South Carolina, were sharecroppers, and her family there was what did she tell us? 21 children in that family.
Yes, I heard that because Chris Hunter sent me that podcast.
Yes.
And I looked at it just yesterday. So
Yeah, and the last I said it's more or less was like a family business,
mhm.
and she said, yeah, you need to have a lot of children out there which probably would have been, I don't know how many siblings John Lewis had, but when we think that in many ways we're only one generation away right now
Mhm.
from many people remembering sharecropping.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and what a scam it was, because the owners didn't pay them well
Yeah.
at all.
Right.
It,
Right.
it really was just more slavery glorified.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
all it was.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so you and John had a lot in common, but you also had your lives were variously different.
Oh,
But there
yeah.
you were in Selma.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I grew up in with certainly white privilege in a middle class town, a
Mhm.
suburb of New York City. A really good high school that turned out a lot of kids going to college.
Mm-hmm.
My parents, my father was a farmer growing up in Connecticut, and his father gave him $100 to go to college.
Mm.
And said, "That's all I can afford. I've got 5 sons, and each of them are getting $100, and that's all I can do." So my father worked his way through college in the school cafeteria. That's how he got through, and my mother and father were determined to pay my way through, which was a glorious thing, because then I had more time to study and also date, of course.
Right.
It was an all-male school, and that can
Yeah.
be tough.
That'd be a little rough.
So yeah, our lives were very different, but we had the same goal. You know, changing the way life was being led by many people in this country, and we were fiercely determined to live that out, and that's what we had in common for the most part in our theological backgrounds.
Mhm.
So we got along really well, and then he went on to have a super career, and I only saw him those days in Congress.
Right.
I mean, I only saw him those days in Selma, and then he went on, to be a very effective voice in Congress, and then a hero to America, especially in Selma when he got so badly assaulted.
So let's talk about that infamous day called Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday.
You actually, MLK was going to be there with you at the time, or is he still in Montgomery at the time?
Well, no, he was going to be with us there. We had a strategy meeting a couple days before Bloody Sunday, which he led, and well, he and John Lewis led it, and then Dr. King got called away. I think it was that Saturday, the day before the march.
Mhm.
He got called back to Atlanta because Coretta King called Martin up and said, "You need to come home because J. Edgar Hoover has sent me a tape and a letter that is very inflammatory, and it's disgusting, but I need to see my husband and talk this thing through." So Hoover was notorious for trying to gather files on people of all persuasions, especially in government, so that he had the power to rule over government officials if they stepped out of line politically or in other ways. He could blackmail them. He was notorious for that. And so he was trying that on King, simply because King was a black leader that had an eloquent voice and great persuasion and much success as a civil rights leader, and SCLC had much success with their protest marches and their nonviolent approach toward changing America. And J. Edgar Hoover wanted to destroy that. He did the same thing with Dick Gregory. He tried to belittle Dick Gregory and annihilate him in ways. But Gregory was incredibly strong, and like King, a huge influence on American people, especially young black people. He loved to go to the colleges and speak to young people because he thought they were the salvation for our country. The young marching minds of young people with their strength and intelligence, and he could really reach them on their level.
Probably no reason to believe that J. Edgar Hoover knew what was about to happen at Selma, and he intentionally pulled him away from me or was it just coincidence? This information came to.
Well, I think he probably did know, because the FBI came into a meeting that we held 2 or 3 days before. 3 days before, I believe. I was privileged to sit in on these meetings.
Yeah, you said that.
You know, and that was just mind-boggling for me because just a young guy, and I didn't know that King had that much faith in me.
Yeah.
But he did, and so I was
trusted you with information.
trusted me with planning information. Yeah. And
But that could be explosive if you were a mole, if you were an insider.
Oh,
Holy moly!
holy moly!
Excuse me,
Right,
they
yeah.
spread about a mole.
Yeah, and I remember this meeting distinctly because it was all about planning for a big march.
Yes.
A big march to Montgomery, which is 51 miles away,
Okay.
and that was going to take a lot of planning, and we weren't at all sure we were going to ever get there because there was a lot of Klansmen in the area and a lot of hatred from the white people of Selma. So in that very meeting that night, there were, I believe it was 3 FBI agents who came to Brown Chapel. Yeah, the meeting was at Brown Chapel, AME Church, and there were some of King's people outside, what we call the lower echelon of SCLC, the guys who were on the line. They were, I don't know how to put it, they're just regular warriors for peace and racial justice. And they were also protecting Dr. King and Hosea Williams and some of the other people. Ralph Abernathy was there, King's best friend. So they asked somebody, or some of the people outside the door of our closed meeting, what would they be allowed to speak to Dr. King? And I think they said no because there was a meeting going on, and they said, well, we really need to speak to him because this is a matter of life and death. So they let him come in, and these FBI agents said, we have direct information that there's going to be an assassination attempt on your life when you march. They knew that they knew somehow that we were planning this march, and they had that information.
Wow, and that's fascinating. On two, number one, they had the information, but number two, you had no reason not to trust these FBI agents that they were saying this for King's own good.
Yeah.
Not that they were trying to put him in a trap or anything, or
Yeah.
get him out.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt, listening to them, I felt it was sincere. But on the other hand, I think 2 of the 3 had Southern voices, and it made me a little queasy.
Yeah, you don't know who to trust, especially knowing what Hoover is doing.
Yeah,
And his attitude towards MLK and the whole movement.
exactly.
And what are these FBI guys doing in here?
Right.
Whose boss is trying to get rid of MLK? Why are you here
Exactly.
telling us? That
Exactly.
must have been really.
Yeah, because my experience with white people that had that same accent was not good.
No.
And so I'm a bit suspicious, but on the other hand, they sounded truthful and they sounded really sincere.
Wow.
And so what amazed me about, well, many things amazed me about King, but what amazed me in that moment was he just looked at them. He said in a very calm manner, "Thank you, gentlemen, for that information. I'll take it into consideration. And now if you'll excuse us, we are in the middle of a meeting." And that was his way of saying
Goodbye.
goodbye. And he went right back to the meeting. He didn't go, "Oh my God, what are we going to do? Somebody's going to assassinate us." None of that. He just went right on with the meeting. But that was a moment I will never forget.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating. So he ends up leaving, though, goes to Montgomery because his wife needs to talk to him.
Yeah.
Get this straight. What's
It's just
going on?
Yeah.
And you all decide you're going to walk anyway. You're going to march.
Yeah,
anyway.
because we were now getting really geared up. And I think probably that's how the FBI knew, because they were hanging around that church all the time, trying to get information out of this guy and that guy and this
Wow.
girl, and you know, and some of the people weren't overly sophisticated. You know, they were asking questions of 16-year-olds, but the 16-year-olds and even the 10-year-olds were in there at night singing the hymns and singing the freedom songs while their parents were listening to the sermons and you know, the latest information on what we were doing. So they could have gotten that information pretty easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you come to the Sunday. You decide you're going to march.
Oh
King
yeah,
has
the
told you
decision
go-
was made. The decision was made Saturday night. It was really interesting because the leadership between SNCC and SCLC was designated, and there were like 7 or 8 people that could have been the leaders of that march since King wasn't there, and they decided to draw straws for it, and they snapped the bottoms of 2 straws, and the straws were held out like this, so you couldn't tell. They were all the same size down here, but 2 of them were short.
Mhm.
And it was John that got 1 straw, John Lewis, and it was Hosea Williams of SCLC that got the other straw. And Jose's a big boy and strong leader, not on the same level as Jesse Jackson or Abernathy in a sense, but he was always out there on the line, putting his neck out. And so he was a good choice, actually. I mean, it was all fate. But those were the 2 that were designated the leaders, because nobody wanted to wait anymore, King or not King. And especially the push from SNCC, because they're a more militant group than SCLC. They were young college students for the most part, and young people in general, 18 to 24 at that age.
Impetuous.
And they had the experience of doing lunch counter sit-ins, and John Lewis went through gaining experience by doing those sit-ins in 1960. Yeah, and then the Freedom Rides, taking the interstate buses down and then getting beaten in Birmingham and places like that. So they had that kind of experience, and they had also been there for 2 years working on voter registration with minimal success, 2%. Whereas King's organization was mostly clergy, somewhat older, if not significantly older in some cases, very nonviolent, and much more followers of Christ, I would have to say, and of Gandhi. And so there was sometimes when there was tension between the 2 groups, and it was never more present to me than after the second march, because King turned around in the second march.
Right.
And I could get get into that if he wanted. And they thought he was selling out, but they didn't know the story, the real
So,
story.
Let's talk about Bloody Sunday itself. What
Mhm.
happened? King did give his blessing, though. To
He
go
gave
ahead.
his blessing.
He didn't just do it because he wasn't there, but he
No,
gave his blessing.
He gave
to
his
go ahead and
blessing. He
do
said, "Go ahead. It's unfortunate I'm here, but go ahead."
it. Okay.
Because the momentum was so strong.
Um, in your article for the Colgate magazine, I told you this myself, and in reading it and what happened that day, just is so emotionally gut wrenching.
Yeah.
And as I told you before, Susan and I had seen several years ago the movie Selma, and I cried through so much of it because it was just so, especially the day of Bloody Sunday, is just, it's horrific.
Yeah.
But you were there. You were an eyewitness to it.
I smelled the tear gas. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what did it feel like to see people going down? Did you see John go down when they hit him with that?
Oh yeah, I was standing only about 5 feet from him.
Oh my God.
It was terrible. Yeah, I mean, we got ourselves prepared that morning, and with lots of people getting up and talking and preparing us for this. We knew it could be a real confrontation, but we were all at least symbolically thinking we're going 51 miles.
Right.
And yet we were totally unprepared for that because we didn't have provisions. We hadn't had enough time to really work out a lot of the details of where you're going to sleep.
Yeah, you were on your way to Montgomery.
Yeah, Montgomery.
Really, Selma was just a starting point.
That's the starting point. Oh yeah, 51 miles of mostly open fields, and some of those fields were owned by Klans people, and some of them were owned by black people. So, but we hadn't really done a whole lot of, to mobilize, and little did we know that we were going to go from somewhere from 500 to 600 people that first Sunday on the 7th, the Bloody Sunday, the 7th, to multiple thousands of people on the 17th when we took off, and then grow to as many as 25,000 people by the time we reached Montgomery on the 21st. It was the logistics of that are mind-boggling. It's moving like an army through there. Clothing. What about the rain? It's hot. It's humid. It's partly rainy season. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, we set off, and we're 2 by 2. It was a very short distance to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 5 or 6 blocks. That was it from Brown Chapel AME Church, which was our home base. And we walked out of that chapel singing freedom songs, and we were nervous but highly motivated. And we very quickly got to the church, got to the bridge, named after Edmund Pettus, who was he was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. And that would certainly be enough to name a bridge after him. But what really perturbed me was that he was also the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in the last year of the what am I trying to say? Reconstruction. Last year of Reconstruction, when he was head of the Klan, the Grand Dragon of the Klan in Alabama. And that bothered me enormously, having already experienced Klan problems in New York. And they have a bridge named after this guy. But anyway, we went up the bridge. It's a long, long bridge over the Alabama River, and you reach the apex of it. And at that point, we looked down, and we saw this large gathering of people on the sides of the street that were already waiting for us, almost all whites, and we saw all these sheriff's deputies lined up in rows at the bottom of the bridge and set back from the bridge just, I don't know, 20 feet or so, maybe 10 feet, I don't remember anymore. And behind them there were, I think I recall, 17 horsemen, sheriff's deputies again, with guns and whips and billy clubs.
This is a far cry from your first march in Charleston.
Far cry, yes. Yeah,
This one is much more threatening.
Oh,
and
much
it's
more.
obvious what now
obvious.
you're up against.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What
I mean-
are you?
The cursing was the same.
Yeah. so many words you can use, right? Unless you make up some. What were you feeling?
Apprehensive, because I didn't expect that much firepower.
Yeah, you didn't expect that opposition, did you?
That kind of opposition, no. I mean, we knew that Sheriff Jim Clark was a bully.
Do you think those FBI guys knew that that's part of what they were trying to warn King about?
I think it was more an assassination by gunshot. Somebody off in the
Just somewhere else,
Somewhere
and not
else.
necessarily
yeah
you're going to get a lot of opposition on Sunday.
yeah that just that they were going to pick him off.
Pick him off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the way I was reading it. So, yeah, that's the way I was reading it.
Why don't we just stop it there, because we are now at another hour. And-
Wow.
Yeah.
God.
No,
I'm sorry.
no, it is absolutely fascinating, Doug. It just because you're an eyewitness. That's what makes it different. All of us have heard stories, or we've listened to things, documentaries, etc. But to be actually sitting with someone who was there, and I can ask you, how did you feel? What was it like? Were you near John when he went down? All of that. And I know there's more to tell because I've read your article, and so I know. But we're going to take a break here, folks, and this will be. We are breaking a record. We will have a 3-part episode here with Doug,
I'm
but
sorry.
it is so worth it. And so it's been great having you with us. Make sure you come back to listen to view the 3rd episode of Hey First Pres, What's Up? So we'll see you then.
When Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away.